Hi, this is Pastor Paul Brunton from the Jesus Movement with Lesson 1 of Believe It or Not, the Bible is Truth. Today I'm presenting Abraham's city of Ur and the background to the scripture from Genesis 15:7, which says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur. I don't know about yourself, but when I read the scripture, I always take myself back in time and try and imagine what would it have been like to live during these times. So when I read the scripture that the Lord just called Abraham out of Ur, my mind gets to thinking, well, where was Ur and what was it like and how did Abraham live? What was the society like? What did they believe? What did they worship? What sort of means of living could they make? Were they all shepherds? Did they manufacture things? Was there shipping? How did people move around? How big was the city? What was its purpose? So there's a bunch of questions that we can actually ask just from reading one simple line of scripture. So today I'm going to explore this particular part of scripture, and I'm going to give you the background to Abraham's original call out of Ur, and I'm going to give you a lot of information that describes and explains exactly what Ur was like and what Abraham was called out of. So if we go back to these times, biblical and secular history at this point in time, it all started in the Middle East, and the dawn of time, as it's called, is when secular history began to be recorded, and that was about 3000 BC. So all of the ancient documents that are recorded, they in fact go back to about 3000 BC, and anything before that is usually not verified. So we're going to use that as our premise of dating, but of course when we look at Abraham, his birth was around 2000 BC, so we don't need to quite go back as far as that in time. So just to give you a bit of a background, the culture at that time was actually quite sophisticated. We're only talking about 10 generations after the time of Noah and the flood. So Noah's sons went out from the ark, which was grounded at Mount Ararat, and from there the generations changed. So of course all these people knew the Lord at this point in time, but within 10 generations a lot actually changed. So what did it look like? Well, basically we had a system of movement that was actually affected by what was known as the Fertile Crescent. So I'll just pop up a map of the Fertile Crescent, and there you can see it. Now the Fertile Crescent is like a boomerang, as we say in Australia, or a curved band there, and it goes from one side of the screen with the Persian Gulf with Mesopotamia on one side, and it crosses over to the other side where the Mesopotamian Sea is, the Mediterranean Sea is, and of course we have Egypt there below with the Nile Delta. And this is called the Fertile Crescent because there's two significant river systems that are in these areas, and of course with the location of where the ark came to the ground, we know that for life to be sustained that we need to have water, and from water we can have grazing, and from grazing we can have crops and the raising of animals. So when they were at the top of the map there, when they came down from Mount Ararat, some of Abraham's descendants moved down to the southwest, which is heading across to Egypt, and on the other side they headed across to the southeast, excuse me, which is down in Mesopotamia. So the descendants of Mesopotamia and Egypt, they were quite advanced by this stage. After 10 generations, there was elaborate drainage and irrigation. Cities were founded and organised into city-states, and city-states are basically a city with the surrounding homes, with the grounds for irrigation and for grazing, and these would constitute what we would call a kingdom. These city-states would cooperate to develop large irrigation projects because they were taking the water from the same river systems, and they also had a complex administrative system, and writing had already been developed. Hence we know that because of the documentation from which we can get this information. So this was true for Egypt, and it was also true for Mesopotamia. Less is known about the regions of Syria and Israel in this early period, but it is understood that they're characterized by small, well-built and heavily fortified cities, and they included Jericho, Megiddo, Beth-shean and Lachish. The inhabitants of these, of course, we read in the Bible, but they're also known historically as the Canaanites. So we can see that it's not surprising that history began in the ancient Near East, especially in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The first book of the Bible, Genesis, explains that after the Great Flood, the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, they moved eastward and found a plain in Shinar, which is Babylonia, and they settled there, which comes from Genesis 11:2. Now Noah's Ark had come to rest on the mountains of Ararat after the flood subsided. This is mentioned in Genesis 8, verse 4. And the source of the Euphrates River, which comes from the Caucasus Mountains north of the Ark's resting place, it flowed southwesterly, so that's up in Turkey today. It would flow southwesterly. Noah's descendants came across its path as they descended from the mountain. Following this source of water downwards onto the plains, they travelled southeasterly along its course until they settled in the fertile land between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. Now, the name Mesopotamia actually means the land between the rivers, and that's a very large region formed between those two rivers. It was fed by this vast river system, and it was full of mineral-rich silt deposits from its source in the mountains. So, of course, this enabled them to prosper the land agriculturally. Noah's descendants, they founded Babylon. And I'm just going to pop up a picture here of Babylon from a beautiful illustration by this artist. And he was a 16th century artist, and his name was Martin van Heemskerk. And so what he's actually represented here is that Babylon, which actually means the gate of God, they mistakenly attempted to build a city with a tower that reached to the heavens so that they could make a name for themselves. And you can see in this picture here that at the background there's the Tower of Babel, which is reaching up into the clouds, representing reaching to the heavens. And in the foreground, next to the river there, you can see the gardens, what known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And you can see from this that they were quite a sophisticated city and nation of people. Now, believing that if they didn't, that they would be scattered all over the face of the earth, God was pretty angry with them because the arrogance of these people basically said that they no longer needed God. Just 10 generations after he flooded the earth, and he said he would never do that again. So what was the situation going to be? These people were building their own tower, and they were aspiring to be like God, that they were up in the heavens and they were all powerful. So God's obviously concerned about this, and the society has become united and godless, and it's seeking its own destiny identity already. So when the people of Babylon sought to control the destiny with the absence of God, their pride walked them into the very circumstances they sought to avoid. The consequence of their actions saw them scattered all over the earth, and their language confused, so they will not understand each other. And this we can read about in Genesis chapter 12, verses 7 to 8. So as we know today, the earth has many different populations of people, and there's many, many different languages. So this is the origin of all of those different languages. And by separating people by communication, no longer can they be powerful and unified because they're unable to communicate with each other. So as a result of this, the movement of people from Babylonia saw some development in the region of the Near East. Egypt became another rapidly advancing society for the same reason as Mesopotamia, and that is the fertile land that's irrigated by the Nile Delta. Societies were predominantly agricultural in ancient times, with the growth of food their main priority for survival. Therefore, those that developed in the most fertile regions would become the most prosperous. So I'll just put the map back up of the two regions again. Now, prior to the time of Abraham, which is on the lower part of the screen there above the Persian Gulf, was actually quite close to the Persian Gulf because the sea levels of those days was a lot higher. So where it's a barren and dry place, about 120 kilometres inland from the Persian Gulf today, At this point in time, the Persian Gulf was very close to where the city of Ur was. So we had that delta area there, which was full of all the mineral-rich soil and water, and that was very close to the sea. So it was a pretty ideal place for them to actually settle. But prior to the time of Abraham, Ur was one of the greatest city-states in Sumer, which is what that southern region of today's Iraq was called in those days. And as part of the Fertile Crescent, it was located from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Iraq. And of course, as I mentioned, the Fertile Crescent goes right around to Egypt. Historians call this era, which is between 3000 to 2000 BC, the dawn of civilization, and we can understand why when they descended from Noah when all other man was wiped out. So what about this civilization? How can we find out a little bit about what Ur was like? So Ur was a city-state, and there's actually written history about this, which begins from the 26th century BC, so 2600 BC. It was documented to be self-governing, and it controlled the surrounding territory with the same laws, language, religious beliefs, and way of life. So places like the Vatican City in Rome today, Monaco, Luxembourg, and Singapore, they're equivalent to these to this ancient city. So they're like modern-day examples. So they're a city with the surrounding residential area and a bit of land, and that would be deemed as a kingdom in ancient days. Now, each ancient city had its own patron deity, or a god or an idol, and the patron deity for the ancient city of Ur was called Nana, or in the Akkadian language it was called Sin. Now, both of these words represent the name for what was actually a moon god. So archaeologists, they discovered evidence of early occupation of Ur, during which Abraham lived in a period classified as the end of the Mesopotamian Bronze Age. And this time was the end of what was called the third dynasty of Ur, and that occurred in 2004 BC. So there'd been three dynasties, so that means three different families who had descendants until such time as they were overcome by a different family. Now, there's archaeological evidence which supports this information, which I won't go into here because it's quite detailed and lengthy, but we do know from the archaeological information that the Akkadian Empire, which was further to the north, they were actually an ancient Semitic empire of people. So that means they were the descendants of Shem, who was Noah's son. And you hear about the languages that are called Semitic. So the Jewish people today, their language is called a Semitic language because it's based on the language that was spoken right back into the time of Noah. So these race of people, they descended from Noah's oldest son Shem. Now, they were founded by Sargon the Great, who is historically recorded to live between the 24th and 22nd centuries BC. And they controlled all other people, including the Sumerians from southern Mesopotamia, and that area actually encompasses modern-day Kuwait and the southern portion of Iraq. And they united them under one rule and eventually one language, which was called Akkadian, and this was known as the first dynasty of Ur. But this dynasty didn't last very long under the Akkadian Empire, and it fell in 2154 BC, and the people of Mesopotamia split and formed two major Akkadian-speaking nations. Northern Mesopotamia, as it became known, reasserted their independence as Akkadian Semites to form what we remember in history as Assyria. And southern Mesopotamia, which was known as Babylonia a few centuries later, were forced to come under the rule of a people who were known as the Gutians. Now, the Gutians were an illiterate, barbarian and nomadic people from the Zagros Mountains, which was northeast of Mesopotamia, so much further north than where the city of Ur was. And these people were forced under the Gutian rule, and they were known as the second dynasty of Ur. Now, under the Gutian king, because they were an illiterate people, there is very little records that was actually kept. So this is a poorly documented piece of history, but we do know from when they started and when they ended because it's documented. And and that it was a very bleak period in between. So as a nomadic people, the Gutian rulers, they were put under pressure when a severe famine struck and grain prices actually skyrocketed. So a power struggle arose and the people pushed to expel them, and each of the city-states that were in southern Mesopotamia fought for their independence until the last Gutian king, a fellow called Tirigan, he was driven out of Utu-Hengel from a neighbouring city-state called Uruk, which is just next to Ur. Thought to be the governor of Uruk, Utu-Hengel established himself as the new king of Sumer, which covered this southern Mesopotamian region. There's actually two stone steles, inscribed monuments that were discovered in the ancient ruins of Ur, and they say that there's a man called Ur-Nammu who was appointed the governor under the king. And although records don't say how, Ur-Nammu later succeeded Utu-Hengel to become the king. Now, when Ur-Nammu became the king, I'm just going to pop on another picture here. This is actually a cylinder seal which is found in the British Museum, and it's actually a seal which shows Ur-Nammu, and it also shows the governor here, and it also shows the moon god by the symbol of the crescent that's actually on there. So when Ur-Nammu became the king, that was when the third dynasty of Ur started, and he ruled between 2112 BC and 2095 BC. So here in the British Museum, as I just said, there's this impression from what is known as a cylinder seal, and that's that black curved object you can see on the screen there. Now the cylinder seal is used to roll an impression on clay, which is that the red clay picture you can see in the background, and it shows that the king of Ur-Nammu, he's actually seated, and he's bestowing the governorship on Hashema, the high priest. This is thought to be about 2100 BC. Now he's actually led by a protective goddess that's called the Amma, and the god Sin, which is shown in the middle, is actually the crescent moon. Now the inscription which is on the side there actually reads, and it says, Ur-Nammu, the mighty hero, king of Ur, Hashema, the governor of Ishkensin, his servant. So we have this documented evidence of who ruled at this point in time. Now, in this time, there's evidence that there was actually temple ruins, and they were called ziggurats. So I'm just going to pop up a picture for you here. And in that picture, you'll be able to see straight directly above my window there in the bottom corner is actually the ziggurat as it's known. Now, they're located in areas that were part of Mesopotamia, and they're dated to around 2000 BC. So we're now getting into that time of Abraham. So in the city of Ur, this king, Ur-Nammu, ordered the construction of several of these ziggurats, including the Great Ziggurat of Ur, which is the one that's in the picture, and they were built to honour the moon god Nana, or Sin, as it's known in the two languages. We can know that this was actually built by King Ur-Nammu because each individual block was stamped, and each of them said Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, who built the temple of Nana. So you can imagine every single block in that building was actually stamped with his name. Now these multi-story buildings, they had ramps or stairways. They allowed people to climb to the top to worship. And the ziggurat was part of a temple complex that was an administrative centre for the city. The shrine was up on top. The ziggurat in the city of Ur was called Etameneger, which means house whose foundation creates terror. Sounds like a fun place, eh? But not something that you or I want to visit to. Now, at this point in time, a devastating famine that toppled the Gutian rule, King Ur-Nammu improved agriculture in the region through irrigation and instituted a code of laws known as the Code of Ur-Nammu. So Semites from the Akkadian Empire were able to live side by side in racial and cultural harmony with the Sumerians, and after just 4 years of rule, King Ur-Nammu rose to fame as a warrior king and later became deified, which means he was made into a god by his people, and it's an honour that was normally only reserved for kings after their burial. Now, there was a couple of generations of kings that came after him. The that passed away, and we get to this period of time where the third dynasty of Ur eventually fell to their neighbours in 2004 BC. Now their neighbours, I'll just go back to the map here, their neighbours were to their east, and on the map there you can see on the right hand side that it says the word Elam. Now Elam is actually in Iran today. So the Elamites, as they were known, were this people that lived in that region. Now they came and they actually attacked the city of Ur. You've got to keep in mind the city of Ur was a very wealthy place, so they thought it was good pickings, obviously, to come there. So the actual city was, taken in a storm, as it calls, and I've got a sample. There was a lament that was actually written. It's called the Lament for Ur, and it's quite lengthy. So I'm just going to give you a sample piece, and it reads, "For the gods have abandoned us, like migrating birds they have gone. Ur is destroyed, bitter is its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like hot bronze in a mould, bodies dissolve like fat in the sun. Our temple is destroyed, smoke lies on our city like a shroud. Blood flows as the river does, the lamenting of men and women, sadness abounds, Ur is no more." So you can get the sense from that absolute devastation was wreaked upon these people, and the city was destroyed, and obviously many of its inhabitants were killed. Now, this Elamite invasion actually changed the course of history at this point in time for the city of Ur, because obviously its powerful status and its wealth was affected by this situation. So looking at this temple, as we've actually shown you, is there evidence for this temple today? And the answer is yes, of course there is. Now, this is a picture I've just put up here, and this was taken in the 1920s. So this was just after World War I, in which the nation of Iraq was first formed. And if you look here from this aerial photograph, you can see the ruins of this ancient city of Ur. Now, it's quite a large city, but you can see on the left ramp at the front, there's actually 3 people that are walking up the ramp, so that gives you a sense of the scale of this. Now, this is incredible because this was built, some 2,000 years BC, and here we are, 1900 odd years later, in the AD. So in other words, we're talking 3,920 odd years later. There's this ruins that are still here to this day. Fortunately, it was captured on camera, as you can see it there, because it wasn't to stay like that. So if I flick to another picture, you can now see the same structure. However, it's been rebuilt with new bricks, and this structure was in fact rebuilt by Saddam Hussein. And his ego was such that when he built this structure, each of the bricks, he had them imprinted with his name as the same way that the ancient king Ur-Nammu had for posterity. Obviously, we know today that his life came to an abrupt end, and as a consequence, the nature or the history of this site has been permanently ruined, if you will. However, in this picture, you can see in the foreground all the different bricks, and they're the foundations of the ancient city which surrounded this ziggurat. Okay, so moving on from there, it's known that today, we're 4,000 odd years later, and we're standing in the centre of a vast arid desert in southeast Iraq now. So the ancient ruins of Ur from southern Mesopotamia are just this massive ruins in this barren sandy desert. It seems incomprehensible, but there was a population of 65,000 people that was estimated to live there. And that's done because they look at the surrounding building structures and the foundations, and they can estimate per square metre how many people would approximately live in those dwellings. So they've estimated at 65,000 people, which basically means it was a very proud and powerful city on the Euphrates Delta. And it was estimated that it was actually the largest city in the world between 2030 and 1980 BC. So around this colossal fortified city stretched a rich countryside, possibly lusher than the agricultural lands of the Nile Delta. So we can look at this and we can think, well, I wonder what it actually looked like in the day. So I'm just going to pop up yet another picture, and here you can see this incredible illustration. And this illustration is done by an illustrator called Balaj Below, and it's just extraordinary. So he's taken all of the historical data, the archaeological digs, all of the foundations, and he actually recreated a three-dimensional image of this ancient city. Now, if you have a good look at it, above my head there, you can see the ziggurat, and you can see the various layers there, and you can see the temple where they went to the very top. Now, it's actually in a compound, and that compound is where the priesthood would reside. Now, the rest of those grounds are various aspects of the palace grounds. Looking around the edge of it, you can see there's a moat to separate it from the general city. In the general city, you can see all of the mud dwellings that are there, all those flat top roofs, the little courtyards in them. And in the background, in the distant background, you can see a square area, which is actually the harbour. There's a break in a wall there, and then behind that harbour is actually the river which went down to the Persian Gulf. Beyond that, of course, is all of the agricultural fields, and you can see the lines of water. So they had sluices and gates, and they would move this silt-rich water around to actually irrigate the farms. And then on the outer skirts of those areas, again, they would actually then have all of their herds. So quite an extraordinary setup, and you can see the sheer scale of it. So when all of these situations happened, obviously this city was destroyed, but you can see here from this picture that that this river that came down here, and they brought the way it worked is that the seasonal thaw of snow and ice in the Caucasus Mountains, at the end of every weather, it would cause the water to flood, and it would break its banks, and it would come all the way down to southern Mesopotamia, and there would be devastating floods. So houses, property, livestock, crops and people, they'd all be swept away. But of course, there was a compensation that came with that, and that's that these mud-laden waters would carry this mineral-rich silt that gave the region its abundant fertility. So what they did is as every year of winter drew to a close, they used a huge amount of labour, and they would confine the river between two enormous earthen banks to prevent the catastrophic effect of a swollen river. And that's that wall that you can see in the background there. That's one of the banks that actually separates the river from the harbour and the city there. Now, this water would be harnessed, and it would be put into vast reservoirs for storage to be used for agriculture at a later date. So speaks of a very sophisticated society. They would drain the marshes because this was a delta, and so they would drain the marshes in the area, and this is where they get all this fertile land around the city of Ur. Afterwards, when they needed for irrigation, the water was redistributed into the plains using a system of canals, locks and channels and drains, and they transport this silt-laden water to the outlying districts. So harnessing the Euphrates River allowed the city of Ur to surround itself with lush vegetation. Of course, they would have had orchards and fruit, would have had grapes and fields cultivated with crops, mainly cereal grains, wheat and barley, and they would have impinged on the surrounding desert, and enough agricultural wealth was generated to support all of its citizens. The perimeter of these agricultural rich fields ran the band of porous semi-desert, and there were the pastures that the farmers would use and the wandering shepherds to tend to their flocks and herds. So this hopefully paints you a pretty good picture. Now, at this point in time, biblically, this is where we introduced Abraham, known originally as Abram. He and his family were from this city of Ur, and we know that they were Semites from the genealogical list, which are provided in the book of Genesis under the heading The Descendants of Shem, which can be found in Genesis 11:10 to 26. Now, just before I move on, I'm just going to show you another quick picture here. This actually shows you the city in the reverse view. So here's the harbour with the boats. You can see there's some wooden construction boats there, and there's also these boats that are constructed from reed, which is they're quite incredible. So these are all documented in history, and there's people in modern times who've actually reproduced these boats. You can see there all the labourers carrying the goods off the boats, and they'll head off up to the city there, and the goods will obviously be traded and sold. So we know once again there's other civilized societies because these boats are coming to and fro and they're actually trading in their living. Okay, so when the city of Ur was destroyed by the invading Elamites in 2004, they actually didn't stay to rule. So the lament for Ur, it paints a vivid and ugly picture of the death and the destruction, but not all people were killed. For it also says there was weeping and mourning after the killing ceased. So not all was destroyed and restoration took place. Now, we have archaeological evidence because of the excavated ruins, and there's also the cuneiform clay tablets which were found. And they talk about how the city of Ur was destroyed and by whom, but the Holy Bible itself doesn't mention this. But once again, this is where we can take what the Bible teaches us and what is recorded in history, and we can put the two together and we can bring to life the scripture. So the book of Joshua, it tells us that Abraham worshipped other gods. Now, the lament for Ur and the cylinder seal from the third dynasty of Ur, it provides us with evidence that amongst the pantheon of gods that were worshipped by the inhabitants of Ur was this moon god, Nana or Sin, the protective goddess Inanna, and the goddess Ningal, which was meant to be the wife of Nana. So they had all these this pantheon, so there wasn't just one, there was numerous gods, and this was common throughout history in ancient times. Now, unlike the later descendants of Abraham, the Holy Bible does not mention any of these gods by name, but we can safely presume that these gods were amongst those worshipped by Abraham and his family, because of course they lived here during this period of time. Now, excavations were done in the early 1900s, pretty much after that picture of that aerial photo that I showed you, and a British archaeologist called Sir Charles Leonard Woolley went in there and he found incredible range of artefacts which brought to life all of the issues concerning, art and architecture and literature and religion and government, etc. So all of that stuff's been documented, and a lot of these are items that were found there exhibited in the British Museum. Now, the homes, they were actually built with a wall along the street with an entrance door. So I showed you that picture a bit earlier where you can sort of see all of these dwellings. But now I'm going to take you to another picture. And in this picture here, we're going to a place called Al-Ula. And Al-Ula is in Saudi Arabia. So I'll pop that picture up. And you can just notice there how incredibly similar those dwellings are to those that are in the illustration. So you think, well, how can this be? Well, these dwellings are ancient as well, but in the environment where they are, there's no humidity and there's been no damage done. So these dwellings have survived from ancient times to today. And you can actually see from this picture that they actually look exactly the same as the illustration that I'd shown prior to here. So once again, we have this extraordinary evidence that's shown in these illustrations that people actually did live in these dwellings, and this is how they were. Now, they weren't very sophisticated, as you can see. They've got mud roofs, they've got some thatch to hold the roof together, that little courtyards. But remember back in these days that there's no sanitation, so these places are very compact and lacking in privacy, I guess. So, the toilet was basically made from brick with a trough leading to a pit filled with soil. So you can imagine the stench that would have been there. Homes could be kept clean, but all of the filth that came out of them, there's no waste collection in these days, so it would have just been tossed out onto the street. So again, you can just imagine it'd be pretty horrific sort of conditions to live in. Now, the city centre, as I mentioned, had what was called the temenos. Now, the temenos is actually the sacred enclosure that was surrounded by a high oval wall. Now, I've got a picture here to share with you, and this this picture, sorry, it took me a moment to bring it up there, but this picture actually shows you the inside area of this temenos. Now, to describe it, there was two temples that were in there inside that were identical. So you've got the ziggurat itself, but there was also two separate temples, and one was dedicated to the moon god Sin, and one was in fact dedicated to his wife, who was called Ningal, and they believed that they retired there every day. Now, there were secondary duties required for the royal couple's entourage. So the Great Ziggurat would tower above these buildings, overshadowing any other structure. So the city of Ur itself appeared like an enormous fortress that was dominating the river and the plain. Now from the Tower of Babel, the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, which is what it said in Genesis 11:9. But amongst them were the descendants of Noah's son Shem, from whom Abraham was descended. Again, this can be found in Genesis 11:26. So these Semites took control of Ur under Sargon the Great, the leader of the ancient Semitic Akkadian Empire. Now, Abraham's father Terah provides his own account in the Holy Bible, which can be found in Genesis 11:27, in which he says that Haran, which is Abraham's brother, that he died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. Now that's found in Genesis 11:28. So we can deduce both from the historical and biblical accounts that Abraham also was born in Ur. So there's the evidence for us to connect Abraham to this city. Now history says that the Semites from the Akkadian Empire lived side by side in racial and cultural harmony with the Sumerians who originally occupied this region. And history also says the Semites came to the region as shepherds. But what we don't know is how Abraham and his family provided for the living. So were Abraham and his family shepherds, sheep herders is what it means, or descended from their ancestors, or did they integrate with the city of Ur and have a different means of provision? We can't ascertain this because neither history nor the Bible reveals this information. But what we do know, with the exception of Haran, which is Abraham's brother, is that Abraham's family were able to survive the destruction and the horrific slaughter of Ur's inhabitants at the hands of the raiding Elamites. So let's have a look at what it was like to live in the city of Ur at the turn of the century in 2000 BC. Now, there's an Assyriologist by the name of Samuel Noah Cramer, and he wrote a book called History Begins at Sumer, and he documents much about Sumeria, which is what's known as the biblical Shinar. Now he says it's the origin of many firsts, including government, politics, education, literature, philosophy and ethics, law and justice, agriculture and medicine, tax reduction, and pharmaceuticals. So this speaks of a very sophisticated ancient society. Now, in 10 generations since the time of the flood, the formation of society as we know it today had begun. So agriculture and trade became its backbone for provision and fundamental for survival. Now, the gods that were also developed, they were usually always orientated about different aspects. So astral deities like sun, moon and stars, fertility, weather, rain, wind and storm, for example, and so on. So sacrifices and offerings were made not just to please, not actually to please God, but to remind them of their sin, nor to give them thanks for God's provision. But rather their only purpose was to appease a pantheon of false gods to bring favour to their lives. Otherwise, they believed the gods would become angry and bring calamity or even death to their doorstep. So worship was not a response to God's provision and protection. Worship was a response to their belief that they needed to provide and protect themselves. So this city was filled with activity. The local population prospered, developing trade and industries such as leatherwork, metalwork, weaving, masonry and pottery. So the city of Ur was a centre for international trade and had two busy harbours joined to the Euphrates River by canals. And this port would continuously load and unload ships with goods to trade, as we actually were mentioning earlier. And again, I'll just pop up that picture to remind you. So here they are with these ships, and they're actually trading with them. Now, the lament for Ur that I read earlier, it actually mentions the city ships as well. So we know historically that they definitely had this harbour and that those ships existed. Now, this large population, they'd filled the streets with a diverse and noisy crowd. I'll just go back to the picture of the ziggurat in use here. And it says, in the quarter that surrounded the sacred area, crowds of pilgrims would make their way to the shrine, bringing animals and crops to sacrifice to the moon god Nana or Sin. And in front of the temples, priests would be busy receiving and recording the gifts offered. The basement of the temenos was packed full of provisions, which the scribes would record carefully on bricks of soft clay. And it's these bricks of soft clay that archaeologists have unearthed from the priestly archives. And so this is how we know much of this today. So Abraham, in his time, he would have entered into this sacred precinct, and he would have passed through the Great Wall into the Temenos. Standing in line, as you can see in the picture there, he would have waited to hand his offering to the temple priest. And he wouldn't be able to help himself but be overawed by the ziggurat, this massive structure that dominated the skyline. Now, giving his offering to the priest, the temple scribe would have carefully taken note and recorded his contribution by carefully pressing the numeric characters into the soft clay tablet. Shuffling forward in the line amongst the others, the high priest would have led the populace up the outside ramps of the ziggurat to reach the shrine to worship the moon god Nana. Now, these temples were staffed by many priests who offered sacrifices, and they also made libations, which we can read about in the Bible, which is a drink offering that's been poured out. However, this is poured out to these false gods. Now, there were singers and musicians who performed worship and praise, and also in these days, unfortunately, there would always be prostitutes, both male and female, who perform public sexual acts on the basis that they believed that it would invoke fertility. Now, understanding that the city of Ur had the world's largest population when Abraham's family lived there, the lament for Ur that I've mentioned earlier enhances our knowledge with verses that tell of wide streets where feasting crowds gathered and open fields that used to be filled with dancers. So this ability to produce food was vital, and it was outside of the city walls. There was farmers with orchards, vineyards and fields surrounding the mud brick dwellings of its inhabitants, and even further out the semi-arid desert plains where the shepherds would be. Now, the sheep and the goats, they're the same species which we can find in the Middle East today. So we've got the white-tailed sheep, they're pied in colour, so a mixture of faded black and white, and again you can see those in the Middle East today. And the goats were also the same, and they would have a well-developed set of horns. They'd have black hair and drooping ears, and their coats had two types of hair. Now, one type of hair was the long fleece on top, and that was used for making the tent cloth. So when you read about the Bible, you have all these black tents. Now, that comes from the goat's hair. And they'd have a finer, softer hair underneath, which would be valued by the spinners, and they make curtains and clothes from them. The milk, it was used to make cheese, and although some of them were sacrificed to the temple, young goats were slaughtered for the meat, as their skins were highly prized for making leather goods. So you can see that nothing was actually wasted. So the animals were a resource. Now, there was an assortment of fruits and vegetables and legumes. So in these times, we talk about olives, onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, beans, cucumbers, melons, grapes, pomegranates, figs, dates, and almonds. So these are very biblical description of food sources, and they're all grown in the fertile delta. And also, they would be grown wheat. They would make bread from the wheat, and from grapes they would make wine, and from fruit they would make syrup. So once again, you can see they had quite a varied diet. Now, Genesis 11:31 says that Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So for Abraham to be mature and married to his wife, 10 years his junior, so he had to be mature, and he was married to his wife who was 10 years his junior. We can find this out in Genesis 17, verse 17. So my estimate for their departure is different to some other people, because I'm actually looking at the biblical chronology, and it gives us a lot of information. So I've estimated that they would have departed somewhere around 1965 BC. Now, not all of Abraham's family left, for his brother Nahor married Milcah, the daughter of his deceased brother Haran, and they remained behind. The book of Genesis doesn't reveal anything about the city of Ur, and this is why I've incorporated this archaeological record, which reveals so much about the place, the society, and what they believed. If you're as curious as I am about what it was like to live there and then I hope that I've been able to paint a picture of where Abraham came from, bringing to life what is not revealed in the Bible. Now, Abraham had literally been born at the end of an era belonging to the largest and most sophisticated society of the time, but also at a time when the city and its temple dedicated to the worship of false god was destroyed and its people were decimated. Having worshipped other gods, he understood that when attacked and defeated, the gods were rendered useless. They had no power whatsoever to protect them. Now the Holy Bible says that Terah, his father, took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out. This is in Genesis 11:31. But if you ask the question, why did they leave? Was it the destruction of Ur, or did God actually have a hand in this? So later on in Scripture we read that when Abraham moved his tents and settled in the land of Canaan, that's in Genesis 13:18, it says that God reminded him that I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, or Ur in Babylonia, depending on your biblical version, and that's in Genesis 15 verse 7. Also in the New Testament, in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, Stephen was chosen to help the apostles after Jesus ascended to heaven. Now arrested for preaching Jesus' message, he had made a speech to the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, as he was known, and other members of the Great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem before they stoned him to death. And what he said was, "The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Leave your country and your people," God said, "and go to the land I will show you." So he left the land of the Chaldeans and went to live in Haran. Now this can be found in Acts chapter 7 verses 2 to 4. So Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin echoes the book of Genesis, and the answer is extraordinary. God actually appeared to Abraham, and he actually said that he was to leave the city of Ur, not Terah. So then you might ask yourself, so why does the Bible say that Terah took Abraham and his family? So when we look at the genealogical heading from Shem to Abraham, this is the account of Terah's, so that's Genesis 11:27. And as Terah was the head of the family, it was written genealogically that Terah took. So in other words, because it was a genealogical statement, and Terah's the father, it actually mentions his name first. So it says that Terah took. But the other scripture tells us quite clearly that God appeared to Abraham and spoke to him and called him out of Ur. Okay, so we get to this stage, we're just coming to the end of this now, that, there was a day that came, and I'm just going to pop up another picture for you. And this is a picture of Abraham leaving Ur. So there was a day that came on the plain bordering the cultivated fields. Abraham and his family set out for the land of Canaan. With them went their shepherds, their sturdy donkeys to carry all their things. And as again, we don't know whether Abraham was a shepherd or not, but it would have been necessary for all that livestock to take some with him. So while the shepherds would finish their preparations for departure on the grassy plains, the local peasant farmers of Ur around them, they would have just carried on with their tasks, sowing cereal crops, operating the sluice gates, and basically being blissfully unaware of what was actually about to happen. So on this day, a day no different to any other, there was no attention paid to a small nomadic tribe of shepherds who were on their way, moving flocks of sheep and goats to a new grazing ground. No one had any idea that they would not return, and no one had any idea that there was a man amongst them called Abram. He was a man called by the very living God. And what he was about to embark on would forever change the world right to this very day as we know it today. So that brings me to the end of this lesson. I hope you enjoyed what I've had to say, and it's helped you to bring to life what the ancient city of Ur was like, and also the fact that God called Abraham out of this society, which we can see was a very sophisticated society. So I'd just like to mention there's going to be many more that continue from this series. In fact, this lesson is taught from my book, which you can see there's a picture next to me there. It's called The Journey to Faith, which is going to be released in 2019. So when that comes out, you'll be able to avail yourself of a copy and read about this and so much more. So that's it from me for now. Now, on the next page, as I phase out of this particular lesson, there's a picture that's going to come up, and there's going to be an icon which has a picture of my face, funnily enough, and that's a subscribe button. So if you'd like to receive all of the future lessons, if you can press on the subscribe button, that'll link you into all of the future lessons, and there will also be a picture on the bottom right hand side of the screen and that will also be a picture of the next lesson. So when you come to the end of this one, you can just click onto that one and it'll take you through to the next lesson. So that's it for me. I pray that you've enjoyed this lesson. May God bless you until I speak to you next time.